Most people are filtering in, and we'll try to start more or less on time. For those who don't know me, my name is Mike Celia, and I have the pleasure to take over from Francois as Director of PEI. So on behalf of PEI, I'm happy to welcome you to the new academic year and our faculty seminar series. As Francois always liked to say, this is a fairly unique seminar series in that instead of inviting outside speakers, we get to listen to our colleagues from within Princeton to hear about the great work that they're doing across the campus. And we're lucky that in the area of environment, in fact, we have terrific colleagues, and we'll hear from a number of them again this year. Just a reminder, October 3rd will be Lin Lu speaking to us from chemical engineering. November 7th will be our friend Francois from geosciences. And December 5th, Melissa Lane, who's the director of the University Center for Human Values, and also an important partner to PEI. A couple of announcements I was asked to make. If you are a geo senior, you're supposed to sign a sheet over here. And if you have brought anything with you, please clean up after yourself and don't leave your trash behind on the seats or on the floor. All right, thank you. Okay, so people are settling in, that's good. Today, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our first speaker, and that's Dan Rubenstein, who is the class of 1877 professor of zoology here in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. I'm sure everyone here knows Dan for any number of reasons. His research, of course, among them. But before I say a few words about that, it's really impossible for me to introduce Dan without saying some other things about, in particular, the remarkable service he's provided to this university, as well as many other institutions. He currently serves within PEI as the director of the Environmental Studies program, which is the program that looks after all of our undergraduate activities within PEI. He served for more than 10 years as director of the program in African Studies. He has had an enormous role in the ongoing development of the Impala Research Station in Kenya, where he does some of his research work himself. But of course, the main thing I have to say is what for me is the most remarkable information that I see on this campus, which is that Dan served as chair of the EEB department from 1991 to 2014. If I can do arithmetic, that's like 23 years. And I didn't know anyone could actually survive 23 years of department chair, but Dan apparently is still living and productive and shows that it somehow can be done. I'm not sure how, but anyway, somehow he did it. Along the way, he received a number of awards, and the only one I'll mention is one that impresses many of us, which is the university-wide President's Award for Distinguished Teaching. So he's not only a terrific administrator, a great researcher, but also a world-class teacher. Dan is a behavioral ecologist who studies environmental factors and sort of individual differences within populations and how they come together to govern social interactions and overall population dynamics for various species. And as the title indicates, his focus tends to be on wild horses, zebras, and asses, and that's the topic of today's talk. Please join me in welcoming our good friend and colleague, Dan Rubenstein.
Thank you, Mike. That was a tremendous introduction, and it really is a delight to be here to talk to you about what matters to me, which is how fundamental research can have an impact on managing the landscape and managing the species that sometimes are loved and sometimes hated. I study horses, zebras, and asses, and they have one thing in common. They're all members of the same genus, so they're very closely related evolutionary kin. They have the same body plan, they have the same teeth structure, their ability to process food is very, very similar. So even though they're different species, they are constructed and perceive the landscape in a similar way. Now, horses, wild asses, domesticated forms, donkeys, and zebras, have all been involved with people for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. For the most part, they've been used for human good. We've used them for work, for transport, for sport, such as rodeos, pleasure in riding, amusement, as Lord Rothschild tamed a few zebras to pull carts around his estate. And of course, we used them in warfare. The Romans would use them as chariots, to pull chariots, and the Scythians rode horseback, and the American Indians did the same. And so it was a means of conveyance that really did change the human interactions, sometimes for good and sometimes for bad. But the interaction with equids also leads to tension that is both detrimental to people and their livestock as well as to the animals themselves. So zebras, for example, are seen grazing on this landscape with a bunch of cattle coming to exactly this same area. These guys, hundreds of thousands of them, denude the landscape, and livestock herders don't appreciate this. The same goes out west in the United States, and by the Wild Horse and Burro Act of 1971, there can only be 31,000 on the landscape, so many are put in feedlots, and some are going to be slaughtered. So there's a tension for livestock and a tension for the equids. Sometimes they're hunted for meat, sometimes they're hunted for skin, and sometimes they're just managed inhumanely. So there is a tension that's going on in our relationship with the species. And what I want to address today is why such conflicts exist. Why is it that people and equids don't get on very well? And what can be done about eliminating these concepts? In order to address that concern, we're going to have to answer some very fundamental questions. And my talk will be divided into two parts. The first part are the insights about the biology and the fundamental first principles that structure the way equids use a landscape. So I'll explore the behavior, the physiology, and the ecology of equids that puts them in harm's way. And then I will examine two case studies, one on horses and one on zebras, that will show us how knowledge of these basic fundamental principles can be used to influence conservation and management strategies, sometimes effectively, sometimes not. Now, to understand and to answer this question on how to reduce conflict, two fundamental questions must be answered. The first is, to what extent do equids and livestock actually compete? It's perceived that this grass blade here and that grass blade there, if I'm a livestock owner, should be in the guts of my livestock and not in the mouths and stomachs of the equids. So there's a perception that these animals are vermin for all people that use a landscape. How real is that? And second, can equid numbers be controlled? Do they need to be boosted in some populations that are going extinct or threatened, or do they need to be tamped down when they're doing too well and putting pressure on the landscape, exacerbating the tension between livestock owners and the wild equids? So can growth be limited or enhanced? In order to do that, we're going to have to look at some fundamental first principles. To answer the first question, we need to know something about diet and the nutritional needs of the species. And second, to answer whether numbers can be controlled, we're going to have to understand the mating system and the reproductive biology of the wild equids in order to understand how they can be managed. So let's start with fundamental number one, which is the dietary and nutritional needs of equids and their competitors. This is the famous mouse to elephant curve that I use and I teach in introductory biology. On a log-log plot, that it shows that the slope of this relationship between body mass and metabolic rate, the oxygen consumption that we use to measure metabolism, is a straight line. The mouse has a much lower metabolism than the elephant. And on a log-log plot, it's a straight line with a slope of 3/4, less than 1. It doesn't scale isometrically. It scales allometrically, disproportionately. And what that means is on a weight-specific basis, the big animals that normally need more food absolutely, in fact, find it cheaper to keep each cell or each gram of tissue alive in their body than the small animal. Because when you divide by weight, you get this negative relationship. So that as body size goes up, the ability to keep a gram of tissue oxygenated actually goes down. So the consequence of this is that large animals are more tolerant of low-quality food. They need lots of it, but they're Catholic. They can survive on good quality food, which is rare, but they can feed on all the garbage and straw and stems that are out there. The small-bodied species, on the other hand, don't need much to keep themselves going, but each morsel must be packed with energy. So they focus on high-quality items which are sparse, scattered, and rare. So from a landscape perspective, body size matters. Ironically, when we're looking at horses, cows, the two livestock that mostly interact negatively, they're about the same body size. So something else must be going on if their diets potentially can differentiate. And that something else has to do with the fact that equids and bovids, the cattle and that whole family, are fermenters. The vegetation they eat, they gain a big bang for the calorie because most of the carbon, the energy, is in the plant walls that protect the goodies inside the cell. And if you can get that energy, you get a big boost. We don't have cellulase, but we can put compartments in our guts for microbes that have the enzyme cellulase to do the breakdown for us, and then we can skim off that extra energy. And there's two ways to ferment. One is to have a partition stomach, the rumen right here, and that's what a cow does. It chews, it eats, it puts in the rumen, it regurgitates, and it goes back down, back up, back down, back up. And that is critical because the digestion, the breaking down, the mastification, increases the surface area for the microbes to work on. The rumen is before the stomach, and it becomes a bottleneck in the system. So the higher the quality of the food, the faster the food can be broken down to be ruminated, to be fermented, to get into the stomach, to be subsequently digested. Low quality food takes a long time, and that's why some ruminants can starve to death with their rumen completely full, because they haven't broken it down fast enough. So it's a very efficient system, but it's a system with a bottleneck. The equids have another fermentation chamber, but here it's after the stomach. It's the cecum, which we have as a vestigial organism, our appendix. We don't use it anymore. But seeds can get stuck in it, and it can get infected. And the whole goal of the cecum was to capture and slow down the passage after digestion. So the fermentation took place after digestion, and assimilation would take place in the intestine. There was no bottleneck, which is why the equids can eat and ferment and process low-quality food. But the downside is they have to spend much more time, twice as much time feeding, as do the bovids. So there's an inefficiency, but it leads to a physiological potential difference in how they subdivide the niche. When we put these two first principles together, we see that body size, as it goes up, should allow animals to eat lower forage quality. And if this is what the ruminant line looks like, then if we do equids, the line should be below it because of the fermentation system, they can go one step further and subsist on even lower quality food. The consequence of this is that our cow and our equid that are about the same body size will in fact prefer to eat on different forage quality items. So this is take-home point number one. The equid of a similar size as the cow can subsist on lower quality food than the cow. When we actually look at the diet, we now can use metabarcoding. We can take the dung that the animals poop out. We can grab that and look at the plant chloroplast and get the DNA from there. We can actually put on these sort of multi-dimensional axes what the diets actually consist of the zebras, the plain zebras, the Grevy's zebra, the buffalo, and the cattle, and you can see they don't overlap. So their diets are fundamentally different, as first principles tell us. But what's even more interesting is that while this demonstrates that competition is being minimized, we can go one step further with actual experiments to see if competition is really even taking place. Now, this is the diet during the dry season, which is when competition should be the strongest. And you can see the diet overlap is very minimal here. We've done other experiments. We call them the cattle-donkey experiment, and which is a simulation of the real world because we're using donkeys as surrogate zebras. We can follow the fates by watching what the donkeys actually eat, and we can then measure what impact they're having on the livestock and vice versa. And our design for the experiment is a classic plant ecological design invented by DeWitt. You take two plant species that are different, you grow them in a common garden under a common set of conditions, and you look at their performance. The growth, the height, the number of leaves, the number of seeds. and you do a pure species A and pure species B, and then in flower pots you do mixtures. And if the mixtures lie along a straight line, then they're substitutable, that they are basically equivalent, using the water and the nutrients to produce vegetative material in the same proportions. But if the line bows up, that implies some sort of mutualism, that the mixture does better than the pure. If the line bows down, that implies some sort of competition because the mixture is performing for both species less well than if they're grown by themselves. So we used that way of doing the experiment so we didn't have to do a big block to factorial design, because we're working on a landscape that is in fact 3.5 square kilometers. And what we did is we had blocked up the landscape and maintained the density of animals as constant on that landscape. And we did pure stands of cattle, pure stands of donkeys. Yes, I am a donkey owner. I'm a livestock owner. And then we did mixtures, 60% cattle and 40% donkeys. And we asked some very fundamental questions about how they perform. We looked at the weight change, we looked at the diet, the feeding rate, the parasite loads, and impact on the vegetation. I'm only going to talk about weight change today, but we did it pure stands of cattle, pure stands of donkeys, or both, and we did them at 2 different stocking levels. This is very important. Commercial ranches tend to underutilize their landscape in the eyes of pastoralists. Pastoralists impact their landscape of 1 cow, 1 tropical livestock unit, for every 2 hectares. Commercial ranches do 1 cow for every 6 hectares. So the low stocking rate of the commercial ranches means the impact on the land is very different, and the ability to keep eating is much greater for that livestock. And that difference is huge. That's a 3-fold difference in terms of the impact on the land. So we did trials for each. And the way to read this graph is to look at the perspective of daily weight gain from the cattle perspective and from the donkey perspective at the low stocking rate of commercial ranches, the high stocking rate of group ranches, and you'll notice the white bars, which are the pure stands of donkeys over here and the pure stands of cattle over here, always perform less well than the gray bars, which is the mixtures. So analogous to our DeWitt diagram, you're seeing that there is a facilitation, a mutualism between cattle and equids on a common landscape. And the reason for this is shown here. Our donkey, which we can watch closely, is eating all the stems and the straws, taking away those pesky things that poke the cows in the face and increase the cow's feeding rate and change the architecture of the landscape so that when it rained, the good forbs that the cows love are accessible. So the cow's performance increased because the negative vegetation that the cows can't subsist on disappeared into the guts of the equids, the zebras, to facilitate the cattle growth. In this experiment, the benefit for the weight gain for the zebras was because the cows, by eating so much, ate all the questing larvae of the parasites that get in the guts of the zebras, which improved their health. Subsequent studies by my graduate student Jennifer Shields showed that in fact it's a very strong mutualism in that when you graze cattle intensively and create these highly productive lawns that keep growing, just like we do with our lawnmowers when we cut them in the summer, then the zebras are attracted to that and the nutrient benefits are also there. So there's a very strong feedback between the equids and the bovids on a common landscape. So the belief that competition drives the world, in fact, is questioned by these results. Sure, during drought, when there's no water and everything has to be eaten down to the sand, then there's competition. But for the most part, competition is minimized by facilitation and mutualism. So that's fundamental number 1. Fundamental number 2 is that water matters. Water, more than food, tends to drive animal behavior. And so you can see here a picture of Grevy zebra and plain zebra together in a mixed herd, generally by water when they aggregate to drink. And you can see over here that Grevy zebra density and plain zebra density in a location tend to be positively correlated. But Grevy zebra is a more water-independent species than plain zebra. And you can see that here, that on average they can go out to about 800 meters from water to graze and to forage, whereas the plain zebra is about 600 meters. There are some populations where the Grevy zebra goes 22 kilometers away from water and the plain zebra has to stay within 2 kilometers of water. But on conservancies where water holes are populated to facilitate grazing of cattle, you're never completely far from water. But the Grevies push the envelope and go as far away from water as they can. Why might they do this? Because close to water, everybody's been nibbling the vegetation. So that far away from water, you tend to get higher quality vegetation. Here is measured by the percent of water in the grass. The Grevies are much higher than random fixed points on the habitat and where the plain zebras are located. Second, as you move away from water, the dung droppings of plain zebra and Grevy zebra also get dispersed by the inverse square law. So you're likely to bunk into a poop pile much less often if you're far from water. And in that poop are eggs of larvae. They are growing up. They become questing larvae as they in the grass waiting for someone to eat them. And as you can see, the Grevy zebra are much less parasitized than the plain zebra. And so the biology of the two species, the water independence or not, tends to allow them to separate their niches even more. But, and this is an important but, not all females in a population have the same needs. And so when you look here, we see as the dry season progresses on this axis, distance to water on this axis, if we choose random points on the landscape, which is this line here, then the expected distance from water obviously increases as water holes dry up. If you look at the distribution of non-lactating, non-reproductive females, it more or less matches the random distribution distance from water on the landscape. But those with very young foals, less than 3 months old, totally dependent on their mother for milk and nutrition, they are much closer to water than their counterparts, the other females. And that tears the social fabric. That's going to be very important. So this leads us into how the mating system and social system develop from exactly this point. You can see here that there's two different cartoons, two social systems, that you have plain zebras, mountain zebras, wild horses, and feral domestic horses. The mesic adapted species that need growing grass and need to drink every day tend to be in a closed system called a harem, where females bond to one male and stay with him for long periods of time. It's a polygynous system because it's one male to many females, so there's failed males out there that live in all male groups and try to steal copulations with the females bonded to a particular male. So that's the closed membership groups here. And this contrasts with the arid adapted species, the Grevy zebra, and the even more arid adapted wild asses, where female associations are ephemeral. And they're ephemeral in part because females have different needs. They can't all stay together, and that puts the male in a tough spot. As a consequence, he sets up territories to try to intercept females as they move about on the landscape. And so, why do plain zebras live in harems? Because females are choosy. Males provide material rewards, extra time to feed, because remember they're hindgut fermenters and they need to spend more time feeding than a cow. And the male is vigilant to prevent himself from being cuckolded by the stranger bachelor males. The females can keep their heads down and they can graze. And so the sociogram that we come up with is the male is the hub of a wagon wheel. Females are strongly bonded to him, less so bonded to each other, and you get this type of mating system. It comes about because the grass, from the perspective of this big-bodied hindgut fermenter, is that this grass blade's not that much different from that grass blade from that grass blade. So they spread out. They don't compete. You can see the percent time grazing as a function of group size is flat. If it was competition, it'd be negative. And we don't see that. What matters, though, is the male you're with. If you're with a high-ranking male, no one messes with you. No strange male will try to come and copulate with you, which means you can graze all the time you want. And so females that are with high-ranking males don't get herded about very often compared to those that are with low-ranking males. And the consequence is it affects their evolutionary potential, their reproductive success, as measured by the number of surviving foals to the age of 1. when nursing stops. Those that are associated with high-ranking males tend to outperform those with low-ranking males. So male rank matters. Males provide time by their vigilance so females can graze. These tight associations, as we've seen, applies both to the mountain zebras and to the horses. And the reason that this works is this notion of scramble competition. No one's defending the resources as a territory. They're not patchy. Everything's more or less equal, and so the rate of success is the time invested to get the food. That we call scramble competition. Okay, and we went through why grevies do not. Again, the foals have to stay near water. The non-reproductives don't. These different females have different needs. In fact, the best water holes are the ones that have high visibility so predators can't sneak up. And as a consequence, males face a dilemma. They establish territories. Female social fabric is torn as these females can go far away from water. These need to stay near water, and you get a fission-fusion society. So the mating systems lead to different social systems because of these different watering, food, interactive needs. And as we said, the same applies to the wild asses. But there is a commonality that's really critical, and that's this concept of social stability. What matters most to these equids is reduction in male harassment. That's what gives females the increased foraging success. So that leads to increased reproductive success in the horses we've seen, but it applies to all the closed membership societies. But ironically, it also matters in the Grevy zebra to the open or fission-fusion societies. Females that are not tied to water are not harassed by males as they wander through the territories. Females that stay near water but stay with one and only one male, thus making a temporary harem, are not harassed either. Those near water wandering through the territories of many males attract the interest of each of those males, and as a consequence, they can't graze. So they become bonded to one male and form for 3 months a pseudo-harem. So there's a commonality between these two divergent forms driven by this water-food interaction as mediated by male behavior. The last fundamental is the most complex. It's the notion of sex ratio. Most populations have sex ratios of 1. The number of breeding males to females is the same. And the reason for that, R.A. Fisher noted, was because of frequency-dependent selection. Whichever sex is rarer has more value. If you're the only male in a population, because most females are making female daughters, then that male is going to sire all the offspring, which puts selective pressure for females to make males. And the vice versa applies too. So since everybody has a mother and father, males and females are of equal value, and generally you have a 1-to-1 sex ratio. Unless females differ in their quality. If females have lots of resources and they can bias the sex ratio of the sex of their progeny and invest in them so that they can be the top of the class, then in fact they will do so. So if males have higher variance in reproductive success in a polygynous society, which they do because some are bonded to females and some are wanderers, the wanderers are going to get much less reproduction than those that are bonded to the females, and a female can invest in the son to make him that much more competitive. So he will be a bonded male. She should do so. The population sex ratio will still be 50-50 because the females that can't do that produce daughters. But those that have the resources produce sons because the sons can disproportionately gain if the investment enables them to disproportionately gain. And so in Equids, we've seen competition is low. It involves scramble or exploitation competition. So you're not endowing females based on dominance. Is there no sex ratio adjustment? We thought that was the case until we started studying the onagers or wild asses in the Negev desert. There we learned that biased sex ratio can limit population growth. This was the problem. The population was started in 1983 to 87 when 14 onager females were translocated and introduced into this crater, the Maktesh Ramon, from the breeding holding area near Eilat. And 10 years later, there were only 16 females. Population didn't go extinct, but it didn't expand. And they asked us, well, you're studying the biology, can you tell us why they're not expanding? We quickly learned why they're not expanding. For one, naive females, those that come from another area, breed less successfully than those that are raised in the crater. So these were native-born females at a given age are much more reproductive, successful than those that came from the Khaybar, the breeding area near Eilat. So that was number one. But the biggest surprise was number two. Here's the progeny sex ratio. 50-50 is this line here. Male bias is up here, female bias is here. And look at this. The age of the mother determines the sex ratio. And inadvertently, the Israelis moved middle-aged females. Now, why did they do that? It made sense from a shekel point of view, from a monetary point of view. You don't move young females because they're silly and stupid and they don't know how to read a landscape. They're probably going to die. So they didn't want to move them. And they didn't want to move old females because old females aren't going to live very long. So they moved females in their prime, middle-aged females. And middle-aged females gave birth to sons, not daughters. Daughters are what's needed to grow the population. And so as a consequence, the population stalled out. Okay, now we can interpret this evolutionarily because most of the females were middle-aged, and sex ratio theory, as I described, predicts that the best competitors will be best endowed and they'll produce sons, which are the middle-aged females that are both knowledgeable and robust. Old females are going to be the most knowledgeable. The young females are going to be the most robust. But the middle-aged females have the best of both worlds, and they produce the sons. The Israelis inadvertently did exactly what you wouldn't want to do. So we told them that, and all subsequent reintroductions throughout Israel, because the Israelis are going to repopulate the world with every biblical organism, they now follow our principles, which is reduce male-biased sex ratios by reintroducing mostly females, of which you provide mostly older females, greater than 10, who will have young primiparous daughters that are going to breed for the first time. Both of these classes are likely to give daughters. And David Saltz, then my postdoc, and I modeled the population growth when we did our study way back here, and we predicted by 2010 the population would be close to 200 individuals. And that's exactly what happened if you followed this precept. So by giving the Israeli advice, they've set up populations following these rules, and the population's now finally expanded to cover the entire Negev desert. So they brought this population back from extinction because the Palestinian wild ass was killed and extincted by the Ottoman Turks. These animals came from Iran surreptitiously, sort of illegally, into Israel, and they were bred up and released, and they've now expanded. So now let's take those four first principles and look at the applications to managing wild populations. So we'll start on feral horses. I study them on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, Shackleford Banks, a land where hurricanes hit quite frequently. This is one of our males. This is what the habitat looks like. There's the East Coast, the Atlantic Ocean right here. And the question is how best to manage this population without harming this fragile frontline ecosystem. This is what protects mainland North Carolina from the ravages of the hurricanes. There's always the fear that these equids will overgraze the island, destabilize the dunes, and destroy this protective feature of the landscape. And so the Park Service was very, very concerned about should they leave any animals out here, and if so, how many, to not destroy this protective landscape. So a little history. Where these horses come from? They came from a shipwreck in 1565, a ship coming from Cuba with horses for the Virginia colonies. Hurricane grounded it on Shackleford Banks. To keel haul it and fix the ship, they left the horses off, and some escaped. And so that's where the population came from. And they ran wild until the Outer Banks were colonized. Why were the Outer Banks colonized? Because this is where a protective cove was, and this was the center of the right whale fishery. Whaling was centered there until the collapse of whale oil and the major hurricane of 1899 drove the people off of the island. But they left their cows, sheep, goats, and horses on the island. They owned these horses. They used them as beasts of burden. But in 1899, they left them all behind. And so therefore, we had all these animals roaming on the island. When I started studying them in the 1970s, this is what the horse population looked like. averaged and fluctuated around 100 horses because there were cows, sheep, and goats that they were competing with on the island. In 1986, the Park Service took over the island and decided it was time to remove the cows, sheep, and goats. And they did, and what do you see happened? The population exploded. They panicked. Oh my God, all these extra horses, what are we going to do? Well, if you do a little back of the envelope calculation, look at the amount of biomass of not only the horses, but the cow, sheep, and goats before they took the cow, sheep, and goats off, and multiply the weight of the horses after they do, the biomass stayed exactly the same. But now you had a culprit, the horses that were a problem, one species. And what do you do with them? Okay? So that's where I entered the picture. The options then were eliminate all the horses. This is what the Park Service wanted to do. Do nothing, which is what I wanted to do. Let nature take its course. Carrying capacity, you saw there was a carrying capacity there. It just happened to not be 100 anymore. It was 225. That's what they panicked them. And if you notice here, it was exponential growth in the beginning and tapering off. Exactly the logistic curve, which we're going to come to in a moment. K is the carrying capacity. And where's the worst place to try to manage your population? Right here at about 120 horses, where the growth rate is as high as possible. Anyway, the question became, do nothing or do you manage? And there's two ways to manage. One is to try to find the sweet spot between the right number of horses and a stable vegetation. That takes money, that takes experiments, exclosure cages to try to find out what that sweet spot might be. Park Service had no money. The alternative was to do it as an evolutionary biologist. What's the minimum population size that will protect the genetic integrity of this species so it could rebound after a crisis like a hurricane and have demographic ability to rebound as well? What is that minimum population size? That's a modeling exercise tuned to the biology we just talked about. And so the Park Service said, let's go with this one. So I then started to model it. All of a sudden, it became a problem of a new constraint, that we had to get this number down around 100. Where'd this come from? Walter Jones of Freedom Fry's fame. He's actually a good congressman. He wrote this bill that said there shall be 110 horses on Shackleford. And I asked him why. He said, your data said there's 104 was the average. So I just rounded up to 110. It turns out that that's not quite right. And he took the science and said, okay, I'll amend the rules to make it what you guys and the geneticists want, which is about 130 horses, and you'll see why. So we built a model, a population projection matrix model, in which you take the number of infants, juveniles, and adults in a given year, and you forecast into next year the number of infants, juveniles, and adults. And I developed this model with Andy Dobson. The first row is the fecundity row. Well, obviously a zero here is an infant doesn't make a baby. Adults make babies, and it's going to be tuned by density dependence. As it gets crowded, the number of resources per female go down, so the fertility will go down. And that's usually expressed in horses by increasing the interbirth interval. It turns out that this population is about a third. You breed every 3 years. A really healthy horse population breeds every 2 years. Okay? But we also had this class here of subadults where the age of first reproduction, whether you breed or not, is also a function of density. So in uncrowded populations, 3-year-olds breed. In crowded populations, they delay to 4. Okay, as we see, they can delay even longer as we start managing. But that's the model here. And then down here are all the survival curves. So the number of infants that become juveniles, the number of juveniles that become adults, and the survival probability of adults staying as adults and not dying. Again, they're all tuned by density dependence. Once you know your census, number of males and number of females, you can compute the effective population size, which is a genetic concept. What is the effective population size? That's the number of genetically distinct individuals in the population. And so if we have identical twins, you have 2 individuals, but the effective population size is 1 because they're genetically identical. So this is a measure of the genetic diversity amongst the players. And it tends to be true that for large mammals, that if your effective population size stays above 50, you're genetically okay. But it turns out to get a defective population size of 50, you need about 130 animals, adults in the population. Okay, so we built this model, and then we had tuned it to a lot of rainfall data that grew the grass, the density dependence for all these different vital rates we could measure, and then we could start putting anthropogenic factors in. Fertility control. What the Park Service wanted to do was use PZP, porcine zona pellucida. How do you get that? You take the ovaries of pigs, you grind them up, and you inject that into the horse, which causes an immune response, and then you develop antibodies to the porcine zona pellucida, which is a glycoprotein on the cell of eggs. That's really powerful because then that hormone can bond to the horse ova and prevent sperm from bonding and causing the acrosomal reaction that injects the chromosomes into the egg. So it's a competitive inhibition. And this is what the Park Service used. And why do they do that? Because the easier way to do would be use steroids. But you're working on a national park. You can't use steroids because if an animal dies, the steroids go in the environment and other endangered species like royal terns will eat that and they will be sterilized. So this is a non-cascading type of population regulation specific to mammals. So we can look at that. That's going to control fecundity, but inadvertently it's going to increase survival. Why? If a female is not reproducing, she's not wearing out. Making a baby and rearing a baby is really energetically expensive. But if you're not doing it, your health, your vigor, and your longevity goes up. So there's a downside consequence of messing with fertility. We can also do harvesting, which in this case is the adoption program. You can take animals off the island and you can adopt them to horse lovers. So you have a dual strategy of control. So we've studied all of this. And we built this model to guide our human decision making, but you have to tune it based on fundamental biology. This is the life table for the horses on the island. So you can see that males have a very early onset mortality as they're growing up. Males do male things, silly things. They fight and they damage themselves. But once they become breeders, their mortality rate goes down. Females, on the other hand, have a more or less constant death rate or survivorship over time because breeding is very costly once they start doing it. If you remember the experiment that was inadvertently done by taking the cows, sheep, and goats off the island, we can see that the survivorship when there was here, this is the situation initially, but when you take the cows, sheep, and goats off, the survivorship went up. That is how we got our density dependence. We did that experiment, and that's critical. Armed with this, we could tune the model. This was our empirical data, and this is the running of the model. And it does a pretty good job of getting us to the same carrying capacity based on the ecology and biology, even though it took 30 years as opposed to 20 years over here. So it's a pretty good fit. And once we had that model, we can now start doing calculations on the genetics, on the effective population size, and you can see that we have a minimum and maximum depending on the sex ratio. If we use the maximum way to control it, then we're really robust. So even if you have a population of around 150, you're going to have good effective population size. So genetically, our approach makes sense. And then we could intervene and say, now what if we start using fertility control? If you start fertilizing animals, you're going to start lowering the birth rate, and that's shown here. But here's the effective compensation, that all these females that aren't giving birth are going to have higher survivorship. So if we're going to manage to about 120, 130 animals, which is what the effective population size says, so you're going to be managing to the worst possible place on the logistic curve, where the population is going to rebound as quickly as it can. So if you do that, and there's no compensation, you're going to have to contracept about 45% of the females in the population. If there is increased longevity, you're going to have to go up to 80%. Okay, so that's the band. It's quite heavy investment. Once you start controlling, you're always going to be controlling. The Adopt Out program has the same potential. Again, it turns out if you want to manage to this half carrying capacity, about 110 to 130 horses, you're going to have to take off each year 6% of the population and adopt them to people that love horses. Well, it turns out that the fertility control worked great. Here is before management, the proportion of females giving birth, about a third. The controls that stayed on the island after management that never got any contraception stayed about the same. But once you started contracepting, you knocked down the fertility rate tremendously on the island. Major success. But there were a tremendous number of unintended consequences. I'll just go through three. One is that birth date changed. Okay? So that gestation lasts about 11 or 12 months in horses. Conception can readily be determined from a foal's birth date, so we know who's who and when they were giving birth. And birth dates for foals born and after contraceptive management is shown here. So this was the distribution of birth dates before any contraceptive management. Most babies were born in May, April, and June. For the controls, over time, there was a naturally widening of the birth date, suggesting that climate change and the warming, the extra rainfall on the barrier islands does increase the condition and spread out the birthing dates. But look what happened with the contraception of control. All of a sudden, we start having babies being born in the winter. And this is because females keep cycling. Decreasing day length usually shuts the reproductive cycle down in most ungulates, but not in these contracepted horses. They keep going and going and going and going, and they give birth all the way into the winter. And this is terrible because there's no off-season recovery for the females or the males that stay active trying to fertilize all these females. So they're wearing out. So that's problem number one. Number two, age of maturity changed. Before, most horses were giving birth at 3, some at 4, 5, and 6. After, the first age of reproduction increased to about 6.5 years of age. So this naturally slows the population, which is good if you're trying to manage it. But is it natural? And why do these effects come about? They come about because of a fundamental change in behavior. Remember, stability is the underlying principle that is important for reproductive success and the structure of equid societies, that role of males in keeping sexual harassment down. And what happens is PZP-treated females keep moving from group to group to group. It's as if they know their male is shooting blanks, and they're not getting pregnant, and they keep moving. Well, each time she moves, she has to reintegrate into a new society. Sexual harassment goes up by the male. Harassment in general goes up by the other females, and you can start to see, like in 2007, 2008, the number of harem changes per season is going up because of PZP, and it's much higher than the old historical rate of 10% of the moves. And so PZP is moving females around much more frequently. That gets the male's attention. Okay, the contracepted females are being harassed by males at a much higher rate than the control females. And this leads to increased stress. So that females that move groups a lot, 2 or 3 times in the summer, have higher cortisol levels, a measure of stress. Now, the stress is mostly during. It will go down in the after, but nonetheless, it will increase. So the conclusion for the horse study, case study number 1, is it's been very, very effective in population control, with a series of unintended consequences which actually reinforce the ability to control the population. So it's been very effective, almost too effective. In those last 3 years, no females were giving birth, and the Park Service was very concerned. How does this play out in the western United States? Most of you have been following some of the press releases that have been going on. There's hundreds of thousands of horses, but no one actually knows the number. And it's much harder to manage them on more rugged land all over the western United States. The problems are that PZP now only lasts 2 or 3 years, but they do roundups by helicopter, which stresses the animals every 5 years. And there's too many horses in holding facilities, and it's consuming 61% of the wild horse budget that the BLM uses to manage. You can see, although there's been a decrease in the number of horses taken off, although it's increased recently, the number of adoptions goes down, which means that the current director of the BLM has just been saying, my budget just to manage these horses in holding facilities is going to be $1 billion. It's going to eat up all my budget to manage all the wild horses out west. So what are the options? Male sterilization? That's permanent. Male chemical vasectomy? manage the populations of the metapopulation. We went through all of this for a National Resource Council analysis of what's wrong with the BML and their management. So all these alternatives are feasible and could boost the ability to manage the horses in a humane way. The problem isn't going away. Salazar nearly punched out a reporter who asked him these tough questions, and you can see that even recently in 2015, there's a talk about sterilizing some of the herds. And even last month, the Congressional Committee votes to allow destruction of wild horses, that they're going to sign the death warrant and rescind the injunction against selling horses to slaughterhouses. And of course, the horse fanciers are up in arms, pushing pressure on Congress to back off of what the new secretary wants to do. So there is a way to manage the horses, but is there a will? Not so far in the United States. But if we move over to Africa and start looking at the management of the Grevy zebra, an endangered species, we see that there's a tremendous will. First, we can look at the dynamics of conservancies where predators roam, and then we can look at the interaction with pastoralists. So the population declined when I started studying from 14,000 to 2,000. And you can see even on the Lewa Conservancy, the numbers keep dropping. Why is this? So we started to look at the dung of the zebras to see if predation was involved. And we noticed by a technique of light microscopy, we could tell the hair differences by the size of the medulla and the cuticle of plain zebras and Grevy zebras. And we could also use the barcodes that the zebras have to follow the fates of individuals using our stripe recognition software, the hotspotter algorithm. And if we do all of that and plug it into our model, we see that the Lewa population, which started at 450, crashes to 226 after 30 years. That they have too low a full survivorship rate because of the high predation. If you look elsewhere in Laikipia, around Impala, it's exactly the opposite. The population of Grevy zebras do just fine because full survivorship is much higher at 50%. And the reason is that the lion density is 6 per 100 square kilometers, whereas on Lewa, the lion density is 31 per 100 square kilometers. If you reduce this down to around 10%, so you get full survival of 50%, the Lewa population goes from 450 to 622. So controlling lions becomes critical for the success of this endangered species on this particular conservancy. But how do you do that? First of all, tourists want to see lions and Grevy zebra. That's an oxymoron. But you need then some way to manage the lions. And we proposed to the Kenya Wildlife Service to do it as adaptive management by using fertility control on the lions so that there'd be numbers of lions that the tourists could see, but that the lions wouldn't produce more babies and put pressure on the Grevy zebra. It took 10 years for the Kenya Wildlife Service to finally allow fertility control. And Lewa is now going to set up a predator-free region to grow the babies, as our model predicted. But we've now suggested to them that they put in orphan predators that will try to hunt but can never succeed because they don't know how to hunt. Because this is important to keep the animals, when they're released, to not be in a naive state of not to know what a predator is. So hopefully going forward, we're going to be able to do this. But why the change of heart by the Kenya Wildlife Service? The change of heart comes because we were working with pastoral people, the native people that use this landscape. And the reason is they share a landscape with the Grevy zebra, but they monopolize the water. We set up a scout program where women go out into the woodland to collect firewood and water and record what the Grevies they see are doing. The men go out on the pasture land when they're grazing their herds. They're given a GPS and a data sheet to record how many zebras they see, what sex they are, what age they are, what they're doing, are they with livestock, are they with wildlife, are they near water, are they near settlements. And then I analyze that data, and we do barazas where we bring the data back to the people. So they earn income, but much, much more. So here's one result. We can show that the Grevy zebra is on the crummy land, not the land where the cattle are. Only 30% are with the cattle. This is actually what the data looks like by age class. And when I presented the results to the community, the Marani said, "But Professor, we heard you last year and we don't do this anymore. The women don't throw sticks and stones at them, and we don't put our dogs at them to drive the grevies away from our herds anymore. We now tolerate them. And sure enough, by 2005, 1 year later, 50% of the sightings are with livestock. So the landscape looks much healthier now, and it has made a tremendous difference in our region. 9% of the population were infants and juveniles, which our models show is not sustainable. But by 10 years later, 21% of the population is infants and juveniles, at the point where stability and sustainability is possible. That's locally. But how about nationally? And this is where citizen science comes in, and this is where I want to end. This is what it's all about. You have insights from primary knowledge. You have applications that give you insights about what might be acting. But then does it make a difference to bring a species back from extinction? So we've done the first full species census nationally by involving the middle class from Kenya and the pastoral peoples over 25,000 square kilometers to census, not count, census and make an estimate of the real population of Grevy's zebra using our hotspotter algorithms. We had people drive around randomly in different blocks, taking 40,000 photographs in 5 counties covering 25,000 square kilometers, a monumental and historic exercise, including the U.S. ambassador and members of the Samburu County Council. So government was involved, both American and national. What we found using our Stripe Spotter software, we could do a site-resite census. We got 2,350 grevies with a tiny confidence interval, a very believable number for the endangered species. And that has led to our understanding of the dynamics by county. Samburu is the heartland of the Grevy zebra. Laikipia, there were none there until 1975. Now it's the largest population. Why? We're now uncovering the biology of why this change. The key is that our models predict that sustainable populations occur when the population reaches 30% recruits. All but Meru, where the predators are, is sustainable. And it was this number that caused the Kenya Wildlife Service to panic and realize that that population needed a boost. Then and only then did they allow fertility control to be instituted on controlling lions. So data, empiricism, evidence matters by people that want to bring back an iconic piece of the heritage of the society. So why does all of this matter? As grevies are now a stable population in Kenya, we now have the governors filling out proclamations and agreeing to spend money to change the behavior of the herders that are putting pressure on the Grevy zebra. So the power to the people to change the movement of the government. So let me conclude. There are 5 pillars that I think are necessary to use biology to successfully manage and conserve endangered species, or to regulate those that are getting too numerous. First, know the secret lives. Know the key biology of the species under threat, which means you have to understand the key resource needs and the risks that the species is undergoing. The interaction with competitor species, cattle, or other wild species is important. The vital rates, the demography, must be determined, and the understanding of how the mating system and reproductive biology will provide those recruits to either suppress or increase to manage the population. Build and then tune the models with this data and expand the scale of the research. Don't just study one population. If it's an endangered species, you have to know all over its range what's going on. And that requires bringing people into the equation, whether they're local people or people from zoos in the developing world. They all can work together and use the emerging technologies. None of this would have been possible without working with computer scientists for that very quick ID recognition system, so we could do the site-resite mark recapture non-invasively, because every zebra has barcodes. And then stand back and let it rip. Let them act, because then the will and the way will create effective action. Thank you very much.
some of you have to run. It's close to 1:30, but others, as long as we don't get kicked out of here, we should take some questions after that terrific talk by Dan. Can you repeat the question once you said it?
Go ahead. I'm sorry, hold on. Go ahead, say it again, Seagrass. Right, so predation is